Everyone's here tonight to talk about I-229, Exit 9, better known to everyone here as Benson Road. Tonight we're going to cover information on the interchange. We're going to talk about the environmental documentation that has to go along with a project like this to move from really the planning side into the construction side. And then we're going to get into kind of the timeline of where we're at now and really when we're going to get to construction. So we'll kind of start with a little bit of history on the project. For me, this project has been going on for it's about 7 years of working on components of Benson Road. And so in 2013, our firm was lucky enough to be chosen with a couple of other firms to work on a major investment study on 229. And so that study went from Solberg Avenue all the way up to 60th Street North. During that, we looked at all of the interchanges. We looked at the corridors, which was a large undertaking. Just the data collection alone took a significant amount of time. As we went through and we learned of some of the concerns that we were seeing in our traffic projections and the capacity of our roadways, we went into further detailed study at locations like Minnesota Avenue, Cliff Avenue, 10th Street, Rice Street, and Benson Road. And so we did 5 really additional interchange studies. We did some really preliminary planning in terms of what the interchange could look like, what the corridor could look like. We did traffic projections to the year 2045. And then we did some really environmental scanning for all of the locations along the corridor. And so that process really got us down at each location to a group of alternatives and an understanding of potential costs, all of those things, so the city and the DOT could say, well, when we start looking at a 10-year forecast, this is how much we can spend in this given year, this is how much we can spend in this given year. And shortly after the completion of the major investment study, the Benson Road project was one of the first ones to come out. And so we've been happy to work on that. As we get specifically into this project, so as we go from the major investment study into this specific project, really we have a goal to complete the planning, move into design, and therefore into construction. And the funding for this has been identified for 2023 in terms of construction dollars. So the things that we have to do is we got to go through traffic planning documentation and get approved through the DOT and Federal Highway, along with environmental documentation, and that's really kind of what we want to talk about tonight. The limits of our planning area really for Benson Road goes from Cliff Avenue over to Sycamore Avenue. And so some behind the scene things that we did also is the city is also looking at, outside of the horizon of this project, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so other things that we looked at in the traffic model is an extension of Benson, like over to Rice Street, what that connection would actually do in terms of traffic volumes. In the environmental study limits, we're very similar. They encompass the corridor from Cliff all the way over to Sycamore. In terms of the interstate, we looked at interstate operations on the main line, the ramps really from Rice Street up to I-90. And so we got a good comprehensive view. We updated all of the information from the major investment study and really sat down and were ready to tackle this project. Now, when we started the project, we knew that we were going to have a limit of construction based on the planning study from about Lewis to somewhere maybe a quarter mile or a half a mile to the east of I-229. And so I think we're kind of fine tuning what those limits are based on how far we've got with the project. So the first thing that we need to do when we're doing an environmental study is we identify the project purpose, and then we figure out what we need to do to satisfy that purpose. And so really our project purpose was to improve traffic operations and enhance mobility out in this area for really multimodal or mobility other than passenger cars. And so as this area developed over time, really it was an industrial, commercial employment area. And frankly, 10, 20, 30 years ago, as these areas developed along 60th Street North, the idea of having sidewalk around these areas wasn't as popular. Certainly now, if you're in a big employment center, people want to get out there and move around during the day, so that need is a lot larger than it used to be. And so when we look at this corridor, we want to make sure that we improve the mobility other than passenger vehicles. And so our project need really put the capacity on our roadway to serve those vehicles or those traffic volumes up to 2045, and so existing and future, and then really fix that lack of accessibility in terms of non-automobile transportation. And so the table on the bottom represents 6 of the intersections along our corridor. And so if you look at existing conditions, we have 4 of the 6 intersections that are at a lower level of service than what we would like to see in terms of meeting the capacity requirements. So if anything in red, level service D, E, or F, those would be level of services that the delay is longer than we want a normal passenger car to experience. And so kind of the key to looking at this, and this is really why it was one of the first interchanges that came out of the 229 study, was we have interchange ramps that we have some deficiencies in the AM peak hour in existing conditions, and when we look out to 2045, we also see those conditions get worse. When you look at this area, we have a very high amount of development that takes place on the west side of 229, and we have very little development on the east side. Understanding that development is really going to start on the east side, if we get any additional traffic really generated from the industrial and commercial areas that they're planning, we got to give more time on Benson Road to that traffic, and the potential of backing traffic up on Interstate 229 is really our concern. And so this project is really trying to address those capacity needs and make it a more accessible corridor. When you think of traffic volumes around the city of Sioux Falls, you really, a lot of cases you kind of reflect on 41st Street, maybe along I-29, as having some of the highest traffic. But when we look in terms of individual intersections, this is just one of the things that help generate our need for additional capacity. The red numbers up on the screen are just individual turning movements that we have during either our AM peak hour, which is in red, or our PM peak hour, which is in blue. And you can see this volume. This is a today volume. We have about between 1,600 and 1,700 passenger cars that want to take a left going northbound off of 229 to westbound Benson Road. And so that would be 3 to 5 times larger than almost any normal intersection in town. You look at 41st Street, people getting on I-29, we're at about 1,000. So it's a significant movement, highest one that we have certainly in Sioux Falls. Conversely, when we look at that evening peak hour, that 1,430, that represents the traffic coming out of that area west of Interstate 229, and that traffic is making its way back towards the interstate. So we have about 1,430, and that's pretty similar around Sioux Falls, that the peak hour in the morning is a little more compressed, and the PM peak hour at night, it expands a little bit more, and so our volumes are a hair lower for peaks in the PM at locations. This is just kind of an overview aerial photo of what's out there now. Over the last 10 years, the city's actually been making some headway in taking sidewalk from Cliffy and moving it closer to the interstate. We have sidewalk kind of sporadically in this area, really no sidewalk that goes across the interstate. The existing bridge, however, does have sidewalk built into it, but there's no connection. And so those are really some of the basis for our purpose and need. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental documentation. So part of moving from really the planning component and identifying what this should look like is also identifying all the variety of environmental resource issues that we may run into. And so anytime when we do a study like this, environmental studies are a must. And so for how we handle it here in the state, there's a couple of different ways to proceed in terms of getting allowance to move towards construction. And so for this project, we looked at 2 methods of environmental documents through the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And so the first one being the categorical exclusion. So this is a document that we sift through all of the resources that we know about, that we hear about, and we determine really their individual or cumulative impact and determine whether it's significant or not. And so that's really kind of the lower grade type of study that needs to be done. The environmental assessment, that is really one tier up. I mean, a lot of times we go directly into an environmental assessment if we just start the project and we really have no idea what type of impacts that we're going to run into. Now, when we went through the I-229 major investment study, we had already done some environmental screening. So in this case, it was very applicable to start in more of a scan method to determine if we could really maintain the document under a categorical exclusion. And so just on the bottom portion of the screen, we've listed really the environmental resource categories that we studied under this process. And so the main categories: land use, surface water, natural resources, cultural resources, physical resources, community resources, and then we look at them in a cumulative manner. And so when we break all those down individually, there's about 26 different things that we're looking at outside of simply the participation by the public in our agency coordination. In terms of design alternatives, and we went through this pretty in detail at our first public meeting, as we ended the major investment study, we really had two major scenarios that we wanted to carry forward. One being what we would refer to as a partial folded diamond interchange, or interchange with a loop ramp, however you'd like to look at it. And so as we went through that refining stage of this project, really searching for a preliminary design alternative to move forward with, out of those we generated 5 scenarios. The other option that was carried forward from the 229 major investment study was a diverging diamond, and we refined that to 2 alternatives as far as this study goes. And so when we look at the loop ramp option, some of our different considerations that allowed us to have 5 different alternatives really was how we handled how traffic got off of the interstate and onto Benson Road. And so in this scenario here, we have a 2-lane on-ramp to manage that 1,600 plus vehicles. Things that we looked at was, do we need to manage this with the free movement so you could come off the ramp, go directly westbound? Certainly that for the vehicles that are driving that's the easiest. They don't have to stop at a signal. The other things that we looked at is, if we implemented a signal, how would that impact things? And in terms of managing pedestrians along the corridor, if you're trying to cross 1,700 vehicles in an hour, there's not really any gaps, and if you don't have a signal to stop them, they'll never get across. And so we looked at other things like pedestrian underpasses that would go below the ramps, tie back in an area where they didn't have to cross traffic of that magnitude. On the bottom here in the southeast quadrant, we looked at a variety of different ramp alignments. And so we have the 2 ramps that we need coming off of the interstate. That's not really all that uncommon anymore. In Sioux Falls, we have a lot of interchanges where you come off in 2 lanes. We had options where we kept the 2 lanes adjacent to the main line. Some we pulled off for interchange clarity. We have the traffic that's going to go eastbound on Benson Road. We had them split off onto another ramp. And so we had a variety of those that equated to 5 different options. When we look at the diverging diamond scenario, we really had it a lot simpler. And so really what we looked at was the expansion of the existing bridge. So we would take it, widen it out because the bridge is really still in good shape. Or is it easier just to construct a new bridge off to the north side? And really that came down to construction dollars and feasibility of an expansion. As we looked at in the loop ramp option, and here, as we talked about, we have 1,400 to 1,500 vehicles really that are coming from the commercial area, the employment centers at night, getting on Benson Road, coming back out to 229. And so is it prudent to have 1 lane that's a continuous flow, free right turn lane, or should we have 2? If we have 2, we kind of run into that same problem as a loop ramp. We'll probably have to signalize it at times to allow pedestrians to cross. And so we analyzed those scenarios, and so we carried all of those 7 options through both of our traffic analysis and really our environmental screening. In terms of our environmental study area, I just wanted to put this in here to point out a few things. And so for our area, we were very fortunate, at least with this project, that as we look to the east of our project limits, that's really where the major concerns are for floodways and floodplains. And so for our project in our areas, we certainly had some surface water locations. We have some smaller streams that run through there. We have some areas that are identified for contamination, and that doesn't mean they're contaminated. It just simply means that there was probably a petroleum product on their site at one time. And then we had some other kind of cultural items that were outside of our work limits or our study limits. And so what we kind of found as we went through the environmental screening, our impacts were really not that great, and that is good for us because certainly we don't want to have any more impacts with our projects than we need to. And so if you kind of look at this matrices that we put together, on the left, this is our resource category, and so we generated about 26 different resource categories. And then we simply went through a matrix format, went through a no-build scenario. That's one thing that we always look at, and certainly could be prudent if we have large impacts on the environmental nature. And then we go through all of the options that we generate. And so in this case, we looked at land use. Does what we're doing cause any harm to the future land use, existing land use? Then we look at transportation and traffic network, all of those things. How does each option affect it? Is it good, bad? Really, there's no difference. All of those things. And we developed this long matrix of all 26 items, and we really use that to scrutinize and determine the right option to move forward with. The second thing we do is at meetings such as this, all the agency coordination we do with the tribal agencies, the Historic Preservation Office, all of those folks we're sending a letter to, making them aware of the projects. We take all of their comments. Again, we put them in a matrix. We look at them and say, okay, does the options that we have address the concern? Or do we need to create a new option? Is the analysis needed to respond to their comment, a concern? Or can their concern be mitigated? And so we put all those in there. This is all really compiling for us to get to a decision on what the right option is to move forward with. And so we went through that process for all of the options. We found that we had generally in nature minimal impacts. And so most of our impacts really stemmed around the loop ramp options needing significant right-of-way outside of the existing right-of-way. That was a concern. And anything that when we got outside of the right-of-way, we had more impacts to wetlands and those type of environmental items. And so as we went through and looked at all of the documentation as a study group and for our DOT conveyance on the environmental side and federal highway, we're moving through this process now with a categorical exclusion, meaning we had very minimal impacts to resources, which was fantastic. In terms of selecting the design alternative, we also have to look at all of the other things in terms of how the options weigh against each other. And so this is really the same thing, looking at the 7 options that we have starting on the left side of the screen. We kind of have some headings up here. We screen the alternatives against the purpose and need, because simply we have meetings like this, we have alternatives drafted. Someone may come up and say, well, I want you to look at one more option. Well, we need to look at that option, whether it may or may not meet our purpose and need, and we want to make sure that we vet through all the options that are available. And fortunately for this process, we really did that well during the major investment study, which allowed us to kind of really fine-tune what we were doing with this project. 2045 is really our projection year for traffic, so we compared and contrast all of the intersections, the ramps, and the main line. One thing that we're doing now that's I think is relatively cool as an engineer, we're doing predictive crash assessments, and so we have tools available that we can look at the traffic volumes and the different type of interchanges, and we can actually look at how they're projected to handle traffic, and do we have the chance of having higher frequency crashes with this type of interchange based on those volumes or lower. And so in terms of the insurance industry, in terms of cost, that's a big factor. If you have an interchange that's millions of dollars more than another one, but it has the potential of causing little to no crashes over a 30, 50-year time frame, that might be the alternative that needs to be selected. So that's really getting to be more of an important factor as we look at these projects. We always look at driver public perception. Is this an interchange that someone has drove through in the area, maybe in the region? We look at that. We look at construction impacts. Can we maintain traffic as we go through the process of building this project? Certainly construction cost is an option. I think one of the major factors in comparative costs is just how much right-of-way we need. That's always a concern. And then we take those environmental items that we've learned about in our environmental screening and we bring those back in. And so this is a long matrix. There's several pages of it. I'll kind of talk about where you can find all of this data. But what we ended up determining was after we went through all of these processes, the diverging diamond interchange was the selected alternative. Just a few bullets that I want to point out. We're going to move forward with an interchange that has two structures, and so we're not widening one. Sounds like that's going to be a little easier to do construction on, and certainly from a constructability standpoint, that works well. We are going to move forward with dual right turn lanes, and for the most part, they will be free movements. Primarily, they'll only stop if somebody actuates a pedestrian button, so it'll be really efficient. This design fits inside of the interstate right-of-way, so that's a good thing. I think at one time we were looking at 13 to 15 acres of right-of-way that we would need if we went with the loop ramp options. And certainly for the folks that own that land, that wasn't desirable, and for us on the cost basis, that wasn't desirable as well. On the arterial side, really regardless of the interchange option, the arterial impacts were primarily identical. And so for the arterial improvements, one really key thing to point out is we are looking at the placement of a raised median to reduce vehicle conflicts. I'll actually talk about that on the next slide. And then this option in itself had the least amount of environmental resources affected. And so the diverging diamonds, and I have a video for those of you that haven't seen how they work to go through, but they're really becoming popular in terms of taking the existing infrastructure and kind of retrofitting it and making it operate in a manner that's much more acceptable to some of the congestion that we're experiencing. And so this is just a little bit blown up, has some street name signs on there, interstate signs, just so you can maybe kind of see what's going on. But one thing to point out, the west side is different than the east side. As we talked about that high amount of traffic that comes in the AM, we have about 1,000 to 1,100 people in that AM peak hour that either get off at Potsdam in the Sanford site here or onto Lewis to get into the employment centers. The rest of them are getting onto other adjacent areas along the corridor or going over to Cliff Avenue. Conversely, we have all of those people wanting to get back out to Benson Road to make that same movement in the PM. And so this section here has to go from the 4 lanes that it is now to 6 lanes. And so there'll be 3 lanes in each direction to manage that peak traffic. And so when we go from a 4-lane section to a 6-lane section, guidelines and design standards for the South Dakota DOT and City of Sioux Falls really go to the implementation of a raised median, and we have other access standards that are required when we do that. And so the hope is when we do that, we can maintain, if possible, the accesses that are already there. But the thing that we're trying to do is really restrict those folks that are on the side streets trying to take a left. And so if you can imagine driving down 41st Street, we have 7 lanes with no median. We have trucks, we see them all the time that take a left across 4 or 5 lanes. It gets very difficult and our crash rates are very high on that corridor. And so that's a driving factor in the implementation of the median. Thankfully, whether you're on Potsdam, we have a good connection through rearage roads over to Lewis to get to the signal. We have East 39th for folks that are on the south side of the road to get to Lewis to the signal if they want to go towards Cliff Avenue. They do have the ability, if they're coming off the interchange, to take a left onto the side street. We don't see certainly the crash severity with the folks coming off of the corridor is what we do coming onto the corridor. So that is just one thing I wanted to point out. In terms of the other side, this is only a 4-lane section. But basically in about 2007, the design standards for the city were updated. This is an applicable place to show a raised median connection that will really extend through Sycamore Avenue, probably further to the east at some point in time. But since we're able to make these improvements and work with the adjacent developers, we can identify where those access points are and really not have to do the same retrofit that we have to do on the other side. And so that's really what we would like to see. But this is just a little more in detail of the options. This is just going to run this video here. And this is what a diverging diamond looks like in terms of operating traffic. And I'll just kind of talk as we go through here, but the traffic at the intersections on either side is running through a signal that only handles 2 phases. And so when you go through and you go to an interchange currently, a lot of times they have left turn lanes, they have right turn lanes, and so if you come across the interchange, you might have to stop at one signal, and then at the next one you want to take a left, and you stop at another signal and you get a green arrow and you take a left. And you have all these different phases that uses a lot of signal time. And so when we do that, all of the movements become less efficient because they have less time. And so if we have no signals at all, we have 100% of the time to work with, no matter what you're doing. If we implement a signal, then we start reducing it. Maybe you only have 60% of the time now in your direction, or 40% of the time. And so this type of interchange, we have all of the movements. They're able to run through an intersection on both sides that are only 2 phases. And when you look at the traffic that is coming across and they want to take a left and get on the interstate, instead of sitting there waiting for a signal, they are just in a free movement now. And so these are really, I would like to say kind of the fad of the transportation industry right now, because the footprints are so similar to what's out there in many cases that they can come in, do some retrofits, and implement an interchange for a more reasonable cost than a full construction. In our case, we need to make some improvements on Benson Road. If Benson Road met the capacity requirements and we only had interchange requirements, our project would be a lot smaller in nature. So we kind of get to next steps. And so really, as we kind of got through the environmental and the selection of the alternative, at the same point we were working on some preliminary design activities to kind of get a higher level of comfort with what we were looking at. That really started about June. And so preliminary design will really kind of go through this year. We'll transition later this year into final design, with the goal of having really everything wrapped up in May of 2022. During that time, kind of our next order of magnitude is, since we got some definition in what the corridor is going to look like, we've got a lot of the design to a point that we know what the impacts are to the landowners in terms of temporary easements or right-of-way. In March and April, probably later March, early April, we'll schedule a landowner meeting so everybody can kind of see this is how the project at this point in time impacts my property. We want to get to you before really we get to that next step of final design. Mid-2021 is really what we're shooting for folks to start working with the landowners for areas that we need to secure additional right-of-way outside of the right-of-way that's available. And so that'll be starting next year. And then really, I think our project ready date, or is when we need to be ready to go with the design, is September of 2022, and that means all the right-of-way is done, all the utility coordination's done, everything is ready to go. And at some point in time between there and December, the project will go out for contractors to bid on, and then really get going in 2023. And Travis Dressen with the DOT and the folks at the area office, they'll be building this project as they normally do. And so, and not saying that there won't be some cleanup work in 2024, which there is usually some additional seeding, sidewalk activities, but really the bulk of the work is going to take place in 2023. And with all of the other projects that are going on in the city, we have in 2022 the 41st Street interchange, this in 23, and some additional interchanges that are being worked on 229 that will come a few years after. And so just in identifying funds to be able to do this was really the timeline that we could get it done. In terms of the project documentation, really all the information that I went over in traffic and environmental, we have on our website, bensonroadproject.com. And then there's only 3 portals on the bottom. the first portal is our public meetings, and so after tonight, by the end of the day tomorrow, we'll have the presentation that we're giving tonight and the boards that are in the lobby. Those will be posted under the public meetings portal. Under the study documents, we have our environmental document scan, and so you can go through the whole list of the tables, the matrices, and look at that. We have all of the information from the traffic analysis, the interchange modification, justification reports on there, and so all of those items are available for you to review as well. And so anything that I have up here, the PDFs, those are all available for you to look at.